craft, but I was struggling to find the inspiration to work on my craft outside of my day job. Getting here at VRC was a huge boon to me personally. Seeing the talent and passion of others really inspired me. And gave me a new outlet to continue that improvement. I also saw the opportunity to lend my knowledge and experience to further the drive of others and help them become better artists. Next, I just want to kind of show some other stuff that I've worked on within VR chat. So this is some Furality outfits that I worked on. The one I'm wearing today for Umbra, the one I did last year for Silva, and I'll be kind of using some of these examples during the talk. I also have a skateboard asset. I know it's a longboard. It's not a skateboard, but I call it a skateboard, but it's a longboard. I've seen your messages. I've gotten them all. I understand. I know I messed up the naming. This was a spacesuit I made for a Halloween contest a few years ago. And also just various collars that I've worked on throughout VR chat. And I'll be using a couple of these during this. And then one that I was more proud of, which is like my first outfit that I ever made for VR chat. I used like Marvelous Designer and ZBrush. I did the audio link actually inside of Substance Designer of all things. And finally, just some kind of various environment assets for a world I was working on, but like a lot of other projects never got done. But it's still nice to see. Okay, so goals of the talk. In this talk, I'll be going over broad discussions of how we make efficient use of our resources. From poly count to texture memory to skin meshes, we'll be discussing methods you can use to not only improve the performance of your assets, but also increase their fidelity. I'll be going over some fundamental topics as well. First, we're going to go over a set of fundamental skills that will help dictate both your performance goals, from camera distance to silhouettes, and then we'll touch briefly on baking in details. All right. So I don't have hard data for this, but just from my experience in talking with other creators, I think on average avatars range from about 30 to 50,000 triangles. VRC has a hard limit of 70,000 triangles before it's thrown into very poor. This means as asset creators, we have around 30,000 triangles to play with, and that's excluding hair or any other accessories that a user might be using. So how do we achieve these targets? Well, first we need to look into some fundamentals when it comes to creating 3D assets for a game. First, I want to go over some basic camera distance optimizations. Knowing your camera distance in a game is an important point of information when you're creating assets for a video game. The camera's placement not only dictates how much stuff is being rendered on screen, but also the fidelity of said stuff. Take the difference between two games, a third-person shooter like The Division and a first-person shooter like Call of Duty. With a third-person game like The Division, the camera is very rarely going to be in situations where the player will be able to make out the distinct details of a given asset. At the same time, when the camera is pulled further back, more of the world is also being shown, resulting in more assets being rendered on screen. Call of Duty, on the other hand, being a first-person game, will put more of their performance budget into the fidelity of its assets, seeing as the camera will be far closer to any given asset. Yet, less of the world will be shown at the same time, as compared to something like The Division, freeing up their budget to increase the fidelity. So what does this mean for us as VR chat creators? VR chat is a bit unique, to say the least. When it comes to camera distance, it's similar to that of a first-person game. Yet, as a player, we have far more control over the camera than something like a first-person shooter. In VR chat, you can literally shove your head through a wall or up another player's nose, and the game will not stop you. So what distance do we optimize for? Personally, I like to keep about a 1 meter distance rule when I'm creating assets. Details need to be able to resolve at a 1 meter distance. I'll tend to exaggerate shapes beyond their real-world counterparts for the sake of legibility, and I will also optimize out certain details that could only be seen if your face is right up against something. As a practical example, take this necklace. At a talking distance, it's very difficult to make out that the necklace itself is actually 2D cards. The triangle count of this necklace could easily push orders of magnitude higher if each link was modeled out. But seeing as I took the distance from the camera into account, I was able to make the decision that saved me thousands of triangles. I'll be actually going into detail on this particular technique a little bit later. Next, we're going to talk about another basic, silhouette. Silhouette also plays an important factor for both our design and our optimization. The silhouette dictates what priorities we have in our decision-making process. I like to break this down to the 3 tiers of reads. First, we have our primary read, our secondary read, and our tertiary read. Primary reads make up a majority of our silhouette and shape language. The secondary read are more medium shapes that have a minor impact on our silhouette. Tertiary reads are details that add very little to our silhouette and can most of the time be defined through textures. To break it down further, I have this collar as an example. In red, you can see that the primary reads are where a bulk of my attention and budget is going to go towards. In green, I've marked out the secondary reads, being mostly spikes, which at certain angles can add to the overall silhouette or contribute to the silhouette. In blue, I've marked out areas that are tertiary reads. These details, if they were geometry, could never break the silhouette, so they are textured instead of modeled in. The hierarchy of reads is not only important from a design perspective, but also from an optimization perspective. With a primary read, I will model in more detail to assure that my asset reads correctly at my given distance targets. Tertiary reads, however, are far less impactful on the silhouette, so they rarely need to be actually modeled in, and in most cases it can most of the time be textured in, saving triangle count. For another practical example, take this hair strand. Between these two versions, I was able to cut down half of the triangles by taking both silhouette and distance into account. You can see in the silhouette that there is very little difference between the two. In the optimized version, I truncated the topology the closer I get to the tip of the hair. Seeing as there's less rounded geometry, I don't need as many triangles to sell the read. I also have take the flatter portions around the top and remove loops from the less curved areas. Another example of silhouette playing into optimization targets is my skirt for the Umbra outfit. I wanted the primary read of the skirt. Silhouette to read correctly without any visible polygons on the edges. However, I didn't need the extra geometry of those loops in the center area of the skirt, so I ended up truncating those edges down, truncating those edge loops right after the edge, saving hundreds of triangles in the process. So you can imagine as you're creating assets, all these little savings will add up after a while, because even though there's only a couple hundred, over an entire outfit, if you take all these ideas into account, you can save so much. Next, we're going to go into normal map baking. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on normal map baking, as that could take up a whole talk in and of itself. But it is an important tool in our toolbox for both reducing triangle count and increasing fidelity. You can see in these two images that the geometry is relatively simple, yet it looks far more high density than what it actually is because of normal mapping. Take the edges of the straps, for example. They are 90-degree hard edge in geometry, but look soft with how the light bends around the surface. I even baked in areas where the straps wrap back in on themselves to create a hole. And instead of that being geometry to create that hole, I actually baked that down onto the flat surface, onto the low poly to fake it. And again, at a distance, you would never notice that the holes in the straps are solid pieces of geometry. You can imagine over an entire asset like a harness where these incremental savings would really start to add up. To distill it down further, take these two cubes. The left cube, I'm not even sure I'm modeling to the left. Oh, left over here. The left cube has a model beveled edge, resulting in a lot of triangles to achieve that smooth edge. The cube on the right is a typical cube with 90-degree edges, but has the bevel actually baked into a normal map. The beveled edge of the left cube isn't enough to break the silhouette at a reasonable distance, so if I bake that detail down, I can save a ton of triangles while still maintaining a soft look to that edge. With this, we don't have to sacrifice our fidelity for performance. That leads us into texture memory. We're going to start with some fundamentals such as texel density, and with that knowledge, we can then use it to better dictate how we structure and lay out our UVs. All right, so before we get started, we need to go over just some basic, what kind of the basic definition of texel density. Texel density refers to the number of texture pixels or texels per unit of 3D area. To create a sense that various props and sets belong in the same world, 3D artists must maintain a consistent texel density across all of their 3D models. So what does this actually look like? This does dip a little bit into avatar creation in and of itself, and optimizing your texture resolutions for VR chat, but I'm going to try and keep this related to assets as best I can. The main concept with texel density is maintaining uniformity across multiple assets. In this example, You can see that the checkerboard texture is pretty uniform across the entire character. However, different elements of the avatar have different texture resolutions. For example, both the body and outfit are using a 2K texture map, while the tail is using a 1K texture map. But despite the difference in resolution, they share roughly the same texel density. There are exceptions to this rule, as with anything. Like characters tend to have a higher texel density around the face and lower around the extremities. Again, this goes into our camera topic from earlier, where our view may be focused on a character's face rather than their hands. So we want to put our budget towards that instead. But what are our texel density goals? Well, personally, I go for a 1024 pixel per 1 meter of resolution. This means that if I have 1K, this means that I have 1K map per meter of surface area to play with. I never release anything beyond 2K resolution as a rule. If an outfit starts to go beyond that point, I will start to find clever UV and shader options instead. This also adds a level of consistency to all my released assets, with all of them sharing a very cohesive density of texture detail. But how do I save texture resolution? I hear you want to use 2K texture for a pair of goggles. That'd be silly. Why would you do that? Instead, let's go over some fun UV tricks you can utilize to save your precious UV space and keep your texel density goals without blowing your memory budget. Classic example of how to save UV space, mirrored UVs. Can see on my harness here that only half of the harness is actually UV'd, with either side being mirrored in its UVs. Pants are a fun example too, where I only the legs are actually mirrored on the pants, whereas the pelvic area is actually uniquely UV'd, allowing for asymmetrical details like zippers and buttons. Similar to mirror UVs are stacked UVs. In this example, I've marked out all the doodads that kind of share the same UV space. Uniquely texturing each one would not only take more time, but also be a waste of resources when the player would never notice that they are just the same texture detail repeated. Now, that chain example from earlier. To cut down on materials, I wanted to keep this leash and collar to one material and one mesh object. In order to achieve this, I made the leash into a trim sheet. Trim sheets are a section of a texture that tiles from one side of the UV space to the other. In this example, you can see that the alpha map texture of the collar and leash, where the leash is a section at the bottom of the texture map, tiles infinitely from left to right. The leash itself is a set of 2D cards mapped to that trim of the texture. This allows me to dynamically increase the size of my chain, as the texture will infinitely tile no matter the length of the chain. So did you know you can also create 2x1 UVs? My longboard asset actually utilizes a 2x1 texture. With it being such an elongated shape, I would have wasted a lot of UV space on a typical 1x1 UV. So instead, I opted for a 2x1, better utilizing my UV space. Also, the wheels and trucks are mirrored. You really have to go in and look to see that the wheels are all kind of the samely textured. Keeping with the longboard, I can also showcase multiple UVs. Popular shaders like Pyomi allow you to choose which UV channel you want a texture feature mapped to. For the longboard, I wanted to keep it at a 1K resolution. However, the graphic mapped directly to UV1 at that given resolution would have ended up blurry and not as crisp as I would have liked. Instead of making the whole thing 2K and going beyond my texel density, I created a second UV channel and filled the entire space of that channel with the bottom portion of the longboard. To blend between the two textures, I also used the blend mask. The blend mask is set to use the first UV channel, and in Pyomi, I use that mask to dictate which of the two textures should be shown. Areas of red are where I want the graphic to be shown. Anywhere else, I want the base color of the board to be shown. This results in a convincing blend between the two textures, as if the graphic was directly painted onto the base color of the board. This also makes it incredibly easy for the end user to switch the graphic out without having to open up Substance Painter. This route does actually increase the amount of textures that I'm using, and may actually be about the same texture memory at the end of the day. The blend mask can actually be a very low resolution mask. I think the board being 1K, the blend mask is probably like 512 or 256. But it's far more user-friendly and a more clever way to maintain your texel density. Right, detail normals, my beloved. Uh, but what if you want your textures to hold up to that gremlin inspecting distance? Well, we don't need to resort to 4K texture maps. Instead, we can utilize detail normals. Detail normals can give the illusion of higher detail at a fraction of the cost. Here we can see the difference between the shirt and hoodie with and without detail normals. In Substance Painter, I did texture this. In Substance Painter, I did texture this without any cloth normals. If I did, the cloth normals at a 2K resolution would have not resolved very well and would have looked blurry and soft inside of Unity. But you can see with the detail normals applied, they give the illusion of a higher density texture map. Detail normals can also be incredibly small. Here we see this detail normal is only 64 pixels by 64 pixels in size, but it's tiled 70 times over the entire surface of the pants. Again, with multiple UVs, you can actually set detail normals to use a different UV channel. It's not in this example, but while mirroring UVs, you can end up with detail normals getting harshly cut around a UV scene, like going different directions. Instead, you can create a second UV channel where the UVs are not only mirrored. Instead, you can create a second UV channel where the UVs are not mirrored and apply that detail normals to those instead. With Pyomi, we can take it to another level using 4 detail normals on a single material. Despite this outfit being 6 pieces of clothing, the entire outfit is actually a single mesh and 1 material. In Pyomi, I can assign an RGB map to tell the shader what detail normals I want where. And this RGB map can actually be considerably lower resolution than the textures of the outfit. I believe while the textures of the outfit are 2K, the RGB map is actually 1K. But one thing you'll notice with detail normals is they can get pretty repetitive by the nature of them tiling hundreds of times over a given surface. To help with this, I like to create relief maps. In my RGB map from the previous slide, any black areas will have reduced strength of detail normal. I can use the curvature in any naturally thin areas to then dictate where I want the detail normals to fall off in strength, resulting in a less noticeable repetition. You can see in the areas of like the cuffs and the trim at the bottom, I've actually reduced the strength of the detail normals, resulting in a nice difference between the two sections, further keeping the material breakup between the two. All right, so we're gonna move on to some skin meshes and materials. Our goal as asset creators are to keep both of these to an absolute minimum, as these have some of the higher impacts on CPU performance in regards to draw calls. I'd highly recommend you go check out Phelan's panel on VRC performance metrics for more in-depth details, but as a rule of thumb for us, we need to do everything we can to keep these at a bare minimum. One big factor that plays into our skin mesh renders is the ability to toggle pieces of clothing. I want to quickly go over some pros and cons of each method of toggling. So yeah, each method has their own pros and cons. Objects and skin mesh toggles are very easy to manipulate and animate, and they make the most sense to a new user. And it doesn't have shader restrictions either, as we're going to talk about later. However, each piece of the set needs to be its own skin mesh renderer, which is a huge negative. Shape key toggles. Shape key toggles are kind of a minimum amount of skin meshes, because you can still all keep it to 1 and just have shape keys that hide the different pieces. However, they are annoying to set up and maintain. Like any other, the hardest set to maintain. They add more shape keys. However, the performance impact of this has been reduced in Unity 2022. Next, we have UV discards. Minimal amount. They also have a minimal amount of skin mesh renders, like the shape keys. They are very versatile and very easy to animate. However, the big negative with these guys is that if shaders aren't fully shown, other players will not see the toggles. And if you're not familiar with multiple UVs, they can be a little confusing for new users. All right, so we'll go a little bit more detail. Object toggles. Object toggles are the type we're most familiar with. Animating the mesh or object to turn it on and off, and tying that to a toggle button on your character. This works just fine for simple assets, but if you go beyond like 2 toggles per set of clothing using this method, I would recommend looking into the next options. Oops. Yeah, so blend shape toggles. There are concerns with adding more blend shapes to a mesh, but that concern, again, has been reduced to the 22 upgrade. And personally, I'll take 5 extra blend shapes on a mesh over 5 skin meshes any day. So what we're doing here is we're squishing the geometry down in relation to the armature to hide it beneath the character's body. It can be annoying to set up, like most shape key stuff. They tend to break if you add more geometry or modify said geometry. You also need to make sure that when you're scaling the geometry down in relation to the armor, you also need to make sure that you're scaling the geometry down in relation to the armature, or else you risk the geometry escaping the body mesh when an avatar bends or like moves limbs around. It's more of a headache to set up, but well worth the time, as you can heavily reduce your skin mesh count. For example, this outfit has 5 pieces I can toggle on and off individually, yet it's only 1 skin mesh renderer. Next, UV discards are a shader-based approach to toggles. We can utilize actually a second UV channel that corresponds to a grid of UV spaces. The UV space we're most familiar with is UV00, but past UV00 we have more areas to play with. Going left of the UV, we have 01, 02, etc. Going up, we have 10, 20, etc. This forms a grid of UV coordinates. Each section of the grid can then be used in a shader like Pyomi to toggle the corresponding vertices within those grid sections. Here's a more simple example. I have a set of cuffs here. There are 4 toggles I want for this cuff set. 1 for the wrists, 1 for the upper arms, 1 for the thighs, and 1 for the ankles. For the UV discard, each set is moved to its own section in UV space. The wrist being at 00, arms being at 01, thighs being at 10, ankles being at 11. In Pyomi, a checkbox means that the vertices in the corresponding UV section are being discarded or toggled off. If it's unchecked, they are not being discarded, which means they're being toggled on. So with the wrist cuffs, they are in 00 space, and the box is left unchecked, resulting in them being shown while the rest are hidden. All right, so with the final stretch of the talk, I just kind of want to go over some rapid fire tips. So I was going through my library of assets. I kind of stumbled onto a few odds and ends that people might find useful. So I want to do some kind of quick highlights. For my Silva outfit, I used a lot of rope. Instead of painstakingly wrapping the rope around the areas where they tie in, I instead just made a little ball out of 2 toruses and floated them at the ends of the ropes. It saves geometry. It saves a lot of geometry and time. I hope this one is obvious, but I should call it out regardless. If you have sections of your mesh that are never going to be seen, just delete those polys. In this example, the inside of the metal belt will never be seen outside no matter what angle the camera is at. So why pay for the expense if you can just remove those triangles? Also, the interior areas of the cloth belt can be seen at certain angles, so I don't want to remove them, but I actually did scale down the UVs in those areas, seeing as they're far less important and will rarely be seen or left to scrutiny. Another fun example of triangle saving, I created a high poly for this collar with leather loops that loop in and around itself. However, for the low poly, I merged the 2 sections together and baked that high poly down onto it. Seeing it's also going to be at the back of the neck, a user will rarely see or even notice the detail. So why pay for the added triangle cost? Yeah, silhouettes are coming into play. The interior of this wheel does not need as much geometry as the outer edges of the wheel. So with the interior wheel, I collapsed every other edge. You can see in the outer area that the cylinder is actually 32 edges, where the interior is 16 edges. Both sets of edges are actually roughly the same length after that collapse. And looking back at this asset, there's definitely an argument to be made that I didn't need to bevel the outer edge of the wheel and just leave that to the bake. So yeah, you can always find more stuff to to work on. Again, chains. I freaking love this concept of using. I use it everywhere I have chains. However, I think with these in particular, they aren't actually tiling like the collar example. They're just a section of the UV that I just plonk them on. But still, it still works and heavily recommended. I would personally never model out chains if you can help it. Another pair of jeans I mirrored. These are a little different because the actual mirror goes up to the belt edge, and only the little portion of the the only portion of the pelvis is actually uniquely UV'd. Still allowing for asymmetric details like buttons and zippers. Yeah, and so my fishnet set actually breaks the 1024 pixel texel density rule. It's actually doubled. Reason being is that thin transparency of the fishnet would be hard to resolve at that texel density. Instead of cranking the texture up to 4K to make the difference, I mirrored the entire clothing and made the trim stacked, saving even more space. This allowed me to keep it at a 2K texture map. This allowed me to keep it at a 2K texture map. Asymmetrical details were not important for the set of clothing, so I didn't think users would benefit from that. All right, and again, most of these props that I've been showing are for a world that I never finished. This one is cool because the VHS tapes use a plane with transparency for its label. The label is a sheet of labels corresponding to a 2x16 grid that can be shifted in UV space in a shader to give give each VHS tape a unique look. Here we can see that each tape appears to have a unique label. Instead of creating unique texture for each VHS tape, I only used two sets of textures, resulting in the appearance that they're all unique without the additional cost. All right, and that's an abrupt end. That's it. Thank you everyone for coming. I hope you're able to learn something from my ramblies, and I believe we'll be taking questions now. And I just realized I didn't ask for questions at the start, but hopefully people added some.
The audience. And if anybody else would like to ask questions, there is a channel on the Discord, Tips and Tricks of Asset Creation Q&A. Please go there and ask whatever you'd like, and I will read it out. So, first question I have is from Tara, asking, what tools do you recommend for diagnosing performance problems for VRChat worlds? I find it difficult, especially on collaborative projects, to isolate major performance hits in a project once everything is coming together.
So despite being an environment artist, in VRChat I've actually rarely touched world stuff. But from what I understand about Unity, that there is a scene inspector or a debugger inspector that I can't quite remember. I can at least speak on the avatar side of things, that there are things you can use like Thrive's memory performance. Again, this is I apologize that this is avatars and not worlds. But on the avatar side of things, you have Thrive's avatar performance tools, which will actually like look at your avatar and read out every texture that it uses and the resolution that it uses, and you can get a really good idea of like what textures are taking up the most space. I remember I had a bug at one point, or an issue at one point, where I had for whatever reason my character was taking up like 20 more megabytes than I anticipated, and I couldn't figure out why. So I opened the tool and saw that I had like 2 sets of textures being loaded onto it, and I was like, why was this happening? I don't have it anywhere. It turns out that even if you have an animator turned off, like weighted 0, the textures inside those animations are still being uploaded to VRChat, even though they'll never be used because the weight's at 0. So yeah, that's a really good tool for that. Oh, also call out to Mark the creator's poly tool. That thing is freaking amazing if you're trying to like squeeze the last little bit of triangle count out of your mesh.
All right, thank you for answering that. I've got another question here. Leon Sarambe asking, what's an object you would recommend a new 3D artist attempt to make to learn all the basics of asset creation?
This is gonna sound weird. Okay, there's two things of this. One thing is that when I worked at a studio I worked at, our asset we would always give juniors when they wanted to test things was a fire hydrant. Like just a regular American fire hydrant. It sounds strange, but it has a lot of really good shapes when it comes to like hard surface. You can really tell like how a person thinks when they go to those shapes and how they model in those shapes, whether they do like bevel modifiers, whether they do subdivision. There's just a lot of like nuance that you can actually put towards that, even though it's a fire hydrant. The other one though, another one I like to give when I'm talking with new people is that literally model things around you. Like I have a coffee cup over there. Like I would literally just take that coffee cup, look at it in front of me, and try to replicate it in 3D, just like you would when you're doing figure drawing, or like a notepad or something. Just take anything around you can visually see and reference. It helps so much.
All right, thank you. I've got another question here from Wisp Readwell asking, do material swap toggles incur a performance cost?
Do material swap toggles? Yes. Technically, if the material swaps are using different, if you're using different texture sets, as I said earlier with that issue that I had, is that if you're using different texture sets, those will still be uploaded. So you do pay a cost because when you're swapping to a different material, if you're not actively using that material, you're still paying for that texture memory regardless. So if you load into an avatar for 8 hours and you never swap using that material swapper, you just paid like an extra 30 megabytes for textures that never got seen. So they do inform a cost, so you just kind of have to be smart, like really think, will a user actually utilize this toggle or not?
All right. Got another question here from Albana asking, how do you determine where to mark seams for unwrapping? Any tips for determining them?
Okay, yeah, there's a lot of nuance to this, unfortunately. There's a couple areas. So especially when you're working on like hard surface assets are a lot easier because they have natural breaks of like materials where say you have like a cylinder on top of a square that might be like a different material than the square. So literally like in the real world there's going to be a material break. So creating UV seam around that area makes sense in the real world, and it makes sense in 3D, so that's really easy. Characters a little trickier. I tend to put my UV seams in areas where it'd be very hard to see them, like in between the legs, like coming up to the crotch. Like this is typically where I put them, or one for the arm, I'd put it like under the arm. So it's more about like tucking them away where a user would like very rarely, or the camera would very rarely see them.
All right. I've got another question here from Rinring asking, how does one bake normals?
Oh man. Okay. So
complicated question.
Normal map baking, is very broad. It's a good question. Normal map baking is super powerful, and I encourage everyone to get into it and look into it. It can, again, it's a whole thing of like, I do a lot of high fidelity assets, but I'm also trying to be smart with my budgets. So even though I am baking on my normal maps, it allows me to cut down on my triangle count, even though I'm adding more texture memory at the same time, because I enjoy like high fidelity, but I don't want to incur a huge cost for that high fidelity. Normal maps are a great way to do this, but they are very tricky when you're first starting out. After this talk, I actually have like a whole folder that's like, I have like 80 websites of just like random tips and just random stuff that I've learned over the years. After this talk, I'll go and link some of those normal mapping guides inside of that chat. There's one that I can't profess my love enough for. I call it the Normal Mapping Bible. It's literally 80 pages of like normal mapping from 2007. But like every topic from that old 80-page document is still so relevant today. So I will, after this talk, I'll go and link all the normal mapping stuff I can.
And by the way, the Q&A channel will be open even after the panel ends, so feel free to keep asking questions as long as Fara has time to answer them. I've got another one here from Squishy asking, people keep telling me not to use transparency, but also to use transparency over polygons. Is there a rule of thumb for what balance you should aim for?
Yeah, the big cost with the transparency, and like I know a few technical rendering reasons, but I don't want to misspeak and accidentally get it wrong. The big issue with transparency is overdraw is kind of like a huge thing. Whenever you have a transparent object in a video game or a real-time render, you're incurring it's having to render that asset first before everything else in the world, because it has to be forward rendered compared to like backward rendered, like this terminology, and I know Polly's staring at me. So whenever you do that, it has to re-render the entire scene behind a transparent object. It has to do a second render pass, which incurs a cost, which is not great, but it's not the end of the world. If you have multiple transparencies, though, stacked on top of each other, you get something called overdraw. That can have a huge impact cost. So you have to be, a lot of stuff when it comes to performance optimizations is that there's positives and negatives to everything, and you're trying to find the best poison for your current setup. So sometimes I might actually add more skin mesh renders if that saves me like 60 megabytes of texture memory, or I might try to reduce my skin mesh renders but increase my texture memory. So it's really just, you're trying to find a balance in everything.
All right, thank you so much for that. Let's see, got another question here from the RPG Slayer asking, how would you fix ambient occlusion issues when you use UV discard?
Oh, that. Yeah, yeah. You're talking about when you're being in a world. Unfortunately, that I don't believe there's a fix for that. Just the way the rendering works is that whenever you're discarding discarding that geometry, that render pass happens. I have to get the order right in my head. That render pass happens after the ambient occlusion pass happens in the world. So the ambient occlusion will get casted on all that geometry, and then after the ambient occlusion has been casted on the geometry in your screen space, then the renderer will then cull out those triangles. So it's an unfortunate thing with UV discards, and I don't think it's anything we can get around.
All right. I've got a question here from Atlas Callisto asking, with material slots being a measured metric for performance, how actually important are material slots for performance cost at runtime?
Oh man, yeah. So there's two differences. In VR chat, your actual, and please someone in the chat correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I understand, or at least when I've been gathered, is that in your avatar performance metrics you have something called where's it at? Material. I'm trying to find it. Material slots. So you have something called material slots. I don't think that's named the best personally, because this avatar only has 3 materials. However, it says I have 7 materials. That's because it's counting the texture lookups in your materials. So I have 7 texture lookups that I'm doing, or something to that regard. Again, please correct me if I'm wrong. However, material slots are far more impactful to performance than texture inputs. So if you can, it's one of those things you do want to be smart about it and try to reduce it as best you can. But adding more textures to a given material isn't the end of the world. However, adding more materials, I think, incurs more of a cost than just adding more textures. So yeah, it's about being smart with it. And there's certain cases where you can't help it, like transparencies. We were talking about this earlier, like glasses for your goggles. Sometimes that has to be a separate material just because the way rendering works.
Right here.
So sometimes you just can't get away with it. Yeah,
good example of that.
Exactly.
All right. Let's see. What else do we have here? Grace Nub asks, with regards to UV mirroring, what is the best way to get identical UVs?
Okay, so I believe the last talk when I was looking at it, they actually talked about a lot of tools you can use for that. Personally, I don't use Blender for UVing because I think Blender's UV tools are very bad and not very good. There are add-ons to make it better. In that last talk, I believe they spoke on like different add-ons you can use that'll help with mirroring. But inherently inside of Blender, it's very hard to like make sure your mirrors are the same. I use a tool called Rhizome UV. It's like $180. It's a little bit costly tool. I would only recommend it if you're like really into it and you want to speed up your workflow. I'd look into those Blender add-ons before going to that tool, but that tool is freaking amazing for doing UVs. You can like cut down the center and it will automatically like mirror the 2 sides and stack them on top of each other as you're actively cutting. It saves me so much time.
All right, thank you for that. Let's see. Sunny the Dingo asks, I've been creating a dummy for clothes because Avatar doesn't have any made for it. Any suggestions on setting that up?
A dummy for clothes. Oh, so like, if you don't, so I guess they don't have their avatar yet, and they're trying to get an idea.
Like a dummy to model the clothes onto.
Okay, that's. There's a lot of things bouncing around on that one. The big thing you want to watch out for that, I guess, if you have a dummy, is making sure your pinch points or your like areas of articulation are the same between the two, because since you can't weight paint it right now, you can't. A lot of times when I'm making clothing, I will actively work on the geometry as I'm weight painting to kind of like test the articulation and make sure nothing's being weird. However, since you can't actively test the armature at the same time, you need to be cautious of where you're putting those loop cuts on your geometry so they line up with the actual articulation. That'd probably be the biggest concern I would have for that.
All right. Dipole asks here, I've had a lot of trouble in the past from assets using UV stacking in ways that prevented me from texturing how I need it, mainly not allowing left-right asymmetry. Can you elaborate on how to decide when texture stacking is appropriate?
Yeah, it's tricky. So as asset creators, I want users to feel comfortable with however they want to texture an asset. Even though I texture one way, this asset a different way, I've already seen people grab this and like texture it all kinds of different ways, and it's super cool, and I love when people do it. However, as an asset creator, I also need to be considerate of my performance targets and not blow them out of the water. There are a couple assets I have made that I have intentionally, that I could have, I so wanted to mirror them so badly because it would have saved me so much texture space. But I didn't do it because I knew users would go in and actually make asymmetrical details. So really, it just comes down to the artists and how they want to handle their performance goals. Because like if I take the time and like mirror everything, I could then increase my texture budget, increase the fidelity of things, and don't have to like sacrifice things. But it does cost users some annoyance. So it's really just based on the creator.
Gotcha. All right. Sundered asks, when retopologing high poly models, is there any specific advice you would give in regards to preparing your low poly for baking?
Okay. That's it. Okay. I love this question. I could talk on this question a lot. It's very broad, so I'll try to keep it down. Yeah, so it depends on what you're doing. If you have like a hard surface stuff and you're doing a sub-div workflow, a lot of the times what I'll do, actually this works for character stuff as well, but I'll take with like sub-div workflow, I try to keep my sub-div or my topology mostly clean for sub-div. I do some naughty things to my sub-div sometimes with edges that don't line up and you have 5 points, but that's neither here nor there. So you want to like use the best clean as best you can, because what I'll do a lot of times when I do my low poly is that I'll take the subdivisions down to like 1 or 2 and then collapse that, and then that's my low poly. From there I go in and like delete loops that I don't need, and that's a really easy way to do it. If you're not doing, again, this is hard surface, if you're not doing a subdiv workflow and you're doing a Boolean bevel workflow, that one's actually incredibly easy to translate to a low poly, because literally you just go in and delete your bevels and collapse all your Booleans, and boop, there you go, there's your low poly. And you have to go in and topologize it correctly so it's not messing up. But God, yeah, there's a lot to that question, and I love it. But unfortunately, I can't go to super detail.
Well, thank you for the fantastic answer. Got a question here from David McTee. How do you add textures on the end or the loop part of the harness? Do you manually draw it in Substance Painter, or can you use Blender texture baking?
The texture, I'm guessing maybe they're referring to the hole that I was describing?
I think, yeah, it's the last part, like where you had the looping bit of your...
Okay. Yeah, so that's all high poly. Like, literally, legitimately, in my high poly, the band is, like, actual to realistic, like, it loops back around, I have the clasp over it, and it's pulling it tight, and there's a geometric, like, hole, you can, like, see through it. That I use that Substance, as I mentioned, like Substance Painter. I use a different tool called Marmoset for baking, because I think it does a better job, but, yeah, you would do that in Substance Painter. Or you take that high poly, like realistically modeled loop, use that as your high poly, and then take your low poly, and what it'll do is it'll hit the rays will hit it, it'll do its funny thing, and then you have a nice like hole in the center. There's a trick to it, because I have this on my Twitter. If you go to my Twitter, I actually talked about this particular, like that loop in particular. Where you have to have an interior plane on the inside of the hole to keep the rays from passing all the way through, or else that'll cause errors. So you have to put a little mesh in the center to keep them passing through. But yeah, it's all high poly.
All right, thank you so much. I've got another question here. Any tips for beginners for texture brushes to use to help optimize the asset's look?
Texture brushes to optimize the asset's look. Okay, sorry, that's a strange, I'm trying to see where they're coming from with that, because it's not really about optimizing. Okay, I can take this one way where, yes, okay, I can take this in a direction. So, say you have a hard surface asset where you want like bolts and screws and like panel lines and stuff, and you don't want to do a high poly, and I do this a lot of times. Like if I need to make something and I know it's going to take me longer to make a high poly, I'll just do it in Painter if it's an easy enough detail. Like bolts, for example, I rarely model out bolts because I just do it inside of Painter. Painter has a couple really good like created brushes for bolts and screws. There is a person. It's on ArtStation. It's this creator called JTO. They have a huge library of height maps, of like hard surface height maps that I use all the time for like vents and bolts and screws. So definitely check them out. That's yeah, that's kind of hopefully I answered their question.
I believe you did. Thank you. Neekout asks, what is your process of making chain textures for your trim sheets? In that case, the alpha clip mask. Do you do them manually, or do you render them out in a different way so they're usable in your previous shown trim set trim sheet UVs.
Yeah, so yeah, okay. That's actually another example of high poly, low poly baking, where I have a high poly chain. I actually created like a geometry node setup to generate chains from one side to the other and kind of randomize their positions, but keeping to account that the very end chains need to stay the same position so they bake the same. I then take a plane, make it the same size of the chains. Well, it comes back in for ambient occlusion reasons, but yeah, so I put a plane over the entire chain set, and then I use baking tools to then bake that down. And so any areas that the rays of the baking miss, so they go through the plane and don't hit the high poly, become errored, and I can use that error mask, or in this case, the vertex color mask. I can use that mask to then say that's my opacity. So any areas of rays that miss the high poly and miss the high poly from the low poly are now my opacity. I have experimented with in the past of that chain trim sheet actually being its own material. I was playing. I need to work on this concept some more. But the idea is that a chain in VR chat that can actually scale up and down, and the texture is just repeating over and over again. And I'm using like tiling inside of Pyomi. As the chain scales, the tiling goes down. Or the chain goes up, the tiling goes up. Just so in VR chat you can actually scale the chain up and down, and it looks like visually the same no matter what.
All right. Ellie Pop here asking, if you're using someone else's model asset, like chains, what's the process to convert that to cards?
Oh, okay. Very similar to my previous answer, where if that's a little tricky. No, actually take that back. It's a little tricky. Because they have their chains pre-modeled out, probably like looped in some fashion, so they're not perfectly straight. Yeah, what you could do is you could just literally take a plane and just model it out along the length of the chain, and then you bake that down from the original to the plane. There's a couple gotchas in there that you might run into, but that's generally how you would do it, I think. The weight, you'd of course have to weight it the same. You could actually utilize. You could grab. Oh, that's yeah. You could grab each fucking. Sorry, I'm just thinking in my head now. You could actually grab each link and collapse it down to a single point. Like take each link and collapse it individually down to a single point, and then you can draw. Oh yeah, then you could draw a curvature between all those points, or a curve between all those points, and then extract that out into a card, so it matches perfectly to it. Ooh, yeah, I like that. Okay, yeah, hopefully that works.
Fantastic suggestion. Got another question here from Hesh. How do you avoid MIP mapping issues on high frequency alpha cutout textures like fishnets?
Oh yeah, that's so there's a number of settings inside of Unity. I actually learned this one the other day. Whenever you're doing in your min-map settings, if you drop it, there's like a button. I can't remember the button. I just learned it the other day, so I can't remember the button. But there's a button inside your texture settings to kind of force the alpha clip based on its mip-map, and that can help a lot reducing the mip-mapping issue when you're clipping. If you're doing, oh god, yeah, it's difficult. It's just something you kind of have to try and work around as best you can. That's why I increased the resolution like crazy on that, but it decreased the amount of UVs I had at the same time. Oh god, I wish I had a better answer. It's tricky.
On the texture settings, I know you can adjust the amount of filtering and what kind of filtering, so playing with those settings can help.
Yeah, there's a lot of playing around with settings. Yeah.
Thanel asks, does Fara teach or offer classes? I think they really want your help.
I adore helping people. It brings me a lot of joy to help like artists who are just getting in and are like they're very excited, and I love that passion. And then on my Twitter, I post like a lot of little tutorials that I think they're helpful when I stumble into something. However, as much as I would love to, I do not have the time. As much as I would love to help people, I don't have the time for it, unfortunately.
All right. I think we are out of time for questions at this point, so I think we can wrap it up here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I hope everyone learned something.
Thank you so much, everyone.
I mean.